So I'll repeat. Okay, this is better. Yeah? Okay. Again, kia ora. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the AHA Center, Ambassador Joe, and also our colleagues from the AHA Center Executive Program from the ASEAN member states, 18 of you. And also welcome audience who are right now watching us live streaming from the YouTube. Welcome to the Leaders Talk of the AHA Center Executive Program, Batch 6. A little bit of introduction about the Leaders Talk, if I may. It's one of the most important part of the AHA Center Executive Program, where we invite inspiring and influential leaders in disaster management and other areas of importance to share their leadership journey with our colleagues from the ASEAN member state, the ACE program participants. It's a unique program, and I would say the most comprehensive disaster management training program in ASEAN. 5 months, involving 23 courses, 19 training partners, 1,000 hours. And it's equivalent to master's degree program. We are learning strategic as well as technical components. It aims to achieve one objective, that is to equip them as the future leaders on disaster management in ASEAN. The program has been supported by the government of Japan through Japan ASEAN Integration Fund. And we also have other dialogue partners, including the United States and New Zealand, supporting this program. New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade is our counterpart in New Zealand. And they have also provided us with an opportunity to bring our ACE program participants every year to New Zealand to learn from the New Zealand professors and practitioners on critical incident leadership. And they just returned from Japan. How did you enjoy Japan? Cold? Yes. And I know that you work very hard from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Right? Good. You won't become a strong leader if your leadership muscle is not hurt. It's part of the sharpening of your leadership skills. So good that that you feel that, because that's also one of the objectives, to strengthen your leadership muscles. This afternoon, the theme is about leadership in volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, or VUCA. Have you heard of this VUCA? Yes. When did you hear this the first time? In New Zealand, okay. Very good. And as you know, climate change makes things worse, right? And makes our world become more volatile, uncertain, and so on, so on. So we have the pleasure of having the front runner of climate change, or the climate change, one of the climate change heroes. She has been negotiating climate change deals, not only negotiating, chairing climate change meetings. We talk about it during lunchtime, and it can be also quite political and tiring. And as a lady, the front runner, being the chair, I'm sure that she has gained a lot of experiences, and we hope to learn from Ambassador Joe about the experiences in chairing these meetings, but also in going through the difficult issues of today, and that is climate emergencies, climate change. So let's start with our conversations. Ambassador Joe is now based in Singapore as the, I have to get it right, High Commissioner of the New Zealand to Singapore. But of course, as I mentioned, former New Zealand Climate Change Ambassador. I think we have the profile here, and perhaps Ambassador Joe also can explain many years of your experience, how you ended up being in the negotiating table, discussing the most pressing, if not difficult issue of today and the future. The difficulties that you have experienced, but we also would like to learn about your personal experience as well, as a woman, and share with others so that they can bring them back home and equip them in case they become also negotiators in the future. So with that, let's welcome Ambassador Jo, and let's listen attentively to her experience. She came all the way from Singapore this morning, and we'll be going back through the traffic of Jakarta also today. So you can sense the strength of Ambassador Jo. But we would like to thank you again for agreeing to speak to us, and also for sharing your wisdom and your experience with the 10 countries of ASEAN. Over to you, Ambassador. Sorry for that.
Okay. Now, I'm not sure if this isn't working.
Yes.
It may work.
I think that one is...
I'll start with this one.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk with you today. It's really great to be here, and I loved the waiata. That was incredibly well done, better than I could do it myself. And it's obvious that the time in New Zealand has served you well. So, tēnā koutou katoa, good afternoon, and very pleased to be talking to you today. Now, I do have a few sort of photographs and things which I will go through, but I don't have any means of controlling them at the moment. So if we don't organise it to begin with, I will run through them at the end a little bit later on. Okay. So climate change has, well, certainly in Singapore, has been hogging the headlines more and more recently. And I think from the point of view of your work, it is clearly going to become more of an issue and give you, unfortunately, plenty to do over the future. So just a super brief recap of, I guess, where I started and where I came to, and how I got to start working in the climate change area, why it mattered to me, and how New Zealand was able to, as a very small country, influence the big negotiations. So I began my career on the trade side as a multilateral trade negotiator with a posting in Geneva. Because I was from New Zealand, I covered a lot of agriculture stuff. That's, you will have perhaps seen, cows, sheep, fields and so on. So agriculture is big for us. But then I moved into a whole new area called trade and services, which was unknown at that point. The WTO had dealt with trade and goods. It had not addressed trade and services. So it was kind of green fields or blue skies, whichever way you want to look at it. And I worked there on the development of a new global agreement that came to be called the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade in Services. I took time out to have a family. I have two very grown-up boys now, and it's quite scary to me that the eldest one is going to be 30 next year. Can't quite believe that. And then I did not go back into our foreign ministry. I kind of did a segue and started working on film and television stuff, not as a producer, but again as a kind of negotiator, and worked to help get access for New Zealand television programs and films into the Australian market under the terms of our free trade agreement with Australia. So spent some time. No, it's not working.
Yeah, it's not working.
Um,
I think I'm sorry.
I spent some time running a public broadcasting funding agency in New Zealand on air, looking to ensure there was New Zealand film and television and radio content in the midst of all the stuff from the United States and a bit from the BBC. So some years later, after that I had left the government service, I was asked to come back as the climate change ambassador for New Zealand. I'm not sure whether it was because nobody else was willing to take the job on, but I think that the only criteria you really need, because frankly at that stage I knew absolutely nothing about climate change, the only criteria you really need are patience and stamina. Because in multilateral negotiations, you're in for the long haul. Trying to get two countries to agree on anything is difficult enough. But if you multiply it out to 197 countries who are members of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, it is exceedingly difficult. Climate change is, I guess, what they call a wicked problem. Even though the science is becoming harder and harder to argue with, climate change is really more of an economic issue than an environmental one. That's me being a negotiator. They always take photographs when you're back. Go back. That's it. Yeah, thanks. They always take photographs of you when you're speaking, so that can sometimes look kind of awful and sometimes okay. It's an economic issue, because to tackle climate change, the whole world, every country, has to transform its economy. It's cross-cutting. It's not something that's in a neat little box somewhere. It does affect all sectors. It affects entire geographies, and it affects all parts of government. The biggest problem is that in order to tackle climate change, there's a bit of short-term political pain to be withstood in order to realise long-term gains, and in fact to ensure that you don't incur significantly greater economic costs in the future by failing to act. However, having the political will to take that short-term pain is not easy, because most governments want to get re-elected. So they want to do things that will ensure they get re-elected, not take unpopular or costly decisions. So when I started as Climate Change Ambassador in 2010, this was just after what had been quite a tense and very, very difficult meeting in Copenhagen, which had failed to reach agreement, despite having lots of the world's leaders there, failed to reach agreement on a new climate change treaty. So 6 months after that, when I first started, there was a huge trust deficit. And the whole of the multilateral system was really on very shaky ground. And there were concerns that the whole thing might kind of collapse. I think in climate change, the issue is intensely political, and there are extremely strong and strongly held national positions, not surprisingly. For some low-lying islands around the Pacific or in the Indian Ocean, it's an existential threat. For others, oil or gas-rich nations who can see that their economic future would be, severely compromised, it's a case of perhaps some form of economic suicide. So these are really, really intense and passionately held positions. There's also, in the climate change negotiations, and probably in many others, a tendency to do a bit of finger pointing. And in climate change, that played out as being historical responsibility, a focus on who got us into this mess, and therefore who should pay or take action to get us out of it. and others saying, well, look, actually our house is on fire, the planet's house is on fire. We don't stop to start asking who lit the fire, we concentrate on putting it out. So you can see that it's a pretty tough deal. So we needed to find a way to get beyond this kind of oppositional, quite aggressive sometimes, finger-pointing approach. And in fact, beyond what at that stage was the only treaty with climate change commitments, the Kyoto Protocol. The problem there being that although a number of countries, including New Zealand, were covered, it really only put commitments to take action on the developed world, and within the developed world there were some notable exceptions, not least being the United States. So as emissions were growing, the Kyoto Protocol was sort of covering less and less of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. At the moment, probably only about 10% of global emissions. So it was clear that wasn't going to be the long-term answer. Our view for New Zealand was that this is a global problem that requires a global solution. Everybody kind of has to do this together. So for us, getting everyone on board was our first priority. No government wants to go it alone. Any minister or government leader will be saying, well, okay, you're asking me to do this or us to do this. What's, my neighbour over there doing? What's this big country over there doing? Because if we take action alone, we're going to be causing ourselves a lot of pain for no observable result. So really, the first thing was to get everyone on board. I guess, give confidence that people were in good company. I like the fact that, a bit like the trade and services negotiations, we were dealing with a blank slate. It was kind of new ground. We could sort of think in innovative ways to see if we could find a way through this intractable problem. So we did decide to give ourselves the freedom to invent. Now, New Zealand is a small country, very small, well, it got land, but small economy. We don't have any automatic right to a seat at the table. We're not amongst the top 20 economies of the world by a long shot. If you like, a member of the chorus in an opera. But the multilateral rule of law does mean that one member state equals one voice or one vote. And that's what we use and used in the climate change negotiations to seek to influence. Now, no one wanted to go alone, of course, but if everybody stands back waiting for everybody else, nothing happens. So somebody did have in the climate change negotiations to kind of take a lead. For the Paris Agreement, this in the second term of the Obama administration became a high priority for the United States and became an area where the United States at that point could see that it was fruitful to collaborate with China. And I think it's without question that unless those two big economies had got together and tried to work out how they could take action, we wouldn't have had an outcome on climate change. But that G2, China and the US alone, couldn't ever be enough. Other strong national positions are in there, and there are multiple constituencies. And they do have very, very, very different voices, and they were never going to stand for anything being railroaded over them. So I guess in these negotiations there's also quite a big difference between what gets said and plays out behind closed doors and what happens in the public gallery, if you like, playing to that gallery. So for me, one of the really important lessons always along the way is not only to know what other countries' or groups' positions are, what a national position is, but also what sits underneath it, what is driving that position. Because if you don't understand that, you can't work out the space you have to play in order to be able to make a deal. So that's crucially important. So just very quickly, the kinds of things New Zealand did, because we wanted there to be a global agreement on climate change. Our government wanted to be, you know, in the tent with a lot of other countries. What we did was, first of all, looked for coalitions and created them. And especially important to go beyond your kind of like-minded group. If you're just preaching to your own choir and kind of reinforcing your own position, that's absolutely not going to get you anywhere. You have to reach out and you have to find other networks and other coalitions in order to be able to get any sort of a result. New Zealand took a very difficult position on the Kyoto Protocol's second commitment period. We decided we would not join it. And instead, we would continue to act as though we were in the Kyoto Protocol commitment period, but we would not be formally bound. Now, this was a very unpopular position we were taking at that point, but we did it because we really wanted, along with other countries, to increase the pressure for a global agreement, a new global agreement, not to have the pressure being put on creating a third commitment period that would cover an ever-decreasing percentage of global emissions. Now, I had to front that decision, and it entailed a lot of quite difficult meetings with other groups or other countries that were upset by what New Zealand was doing. But that taught me another really important lesson, and that was not to kind of shy away from or hide from things that were difficult. It was really important to get out there and be honest and upfront about what we were doing and why we were doing it, and to give as much reassurance as we could that we weren't at all walking away from the UNFCCC or climate change negotiations. The next thing we did was we had to find our way into some of the smaller rooms. And we did that by being as useful as we could, by trying to find constructive solutions, by being a bridge builder, and by having people who could be persuasive and influence others, and you know, whether that was our minister or me or other experts on the delegation. So we ended up, surprisingly, being regular guests at a thing called the Major Economies Forum. And as I said, we're far from being a major economy in the world. We then also workshopped ideas, and that's the bit I really loved. I love being able to sort of think, well, okay, let's throw everything we know out the window and start again and do something different. So every year, for 5 years, I convened a group of 20 lead negotiators from around the world, brought them to New Zealand, did things like, we didn't go to marae, but we did things that had a Māori cultural significance. We took them away to rural retreats where they couldn't escape, and gave them exercises, some of them silly, some of them highly creative, some of them serious, and sat around the table and workshopped stuff that could never be done in big meeting rooms. And we carefully did that in a way that brought a whole range of different views together. We also worked hard to build a domestic constituency, and when you're dealing with other government departments, they have a different perspective from your own. As a foreign ministry, we're acutely conscious of our international standing and reputation. But that doesn't matter a toss, really, quite often, or other government departments like finance departments don't necessarily understand that. If you can't measure it, how can you measure an international reputation or standing? It's very difficult to make persuasive arguments that this is super important, but we worked on that. I don't want to go into detail, but the critical aspects of the Paris Agreement that got it across the line in a huge ministerial meeting in Paris at the end of 2015 were these things, because it kind of turned the rules up until then of multilateral treaties a bit on their head. Instead of sort of carving up responsibility around the world, we made this a non-punitive agreement. So the contributions, the commitments that countries were making were non-binding. And if you fail to meet a target, there is no consequence in terms of a cost to you. You don't have to pay. But I guess what you would need to do is stand up in front of your peers and explain what happened and why. We made sure that the United States could join the Paris Agreement by means of the President's executive authority, rather than it needing to go through Congress, because that would never have succeeded. Now that was good. It meant the US joined the agreement, but it was also bad, because it meant that just as they joined by executive order, they could announce, as they did, President Trump did in mid-2017, that they would withdraw also by executive order. But it did mean we could get the agreement across the line. We also shifted from having two very broad groups of countries, some of whom took commitments and many of whom did not, to an approach that was taken on the basis of your own national circumstances. So every individual country can determine what it can most ambitiously and realistically put on the table. They're not told or ordered what to do. It is your own choice as a country to put something forward. And that was critical particularly for developing countries, to feel comfortable and confident to be able to put things on the table. But it wasn't all, anything you like, because it's an international treaty, really important, that there are also some parameters, some rules. So it became a kind of hybrid of a bottom-up, you put what you can on the table, and top-down, here are some rules. And the rules, really importantly, around transparency, being transparent about measuring your greenhouse gas emissions and the progress you're making towards your targets, and accountability, being held to account for the progress you are or are not making. And finally, there's an ambition mechanism that is designed to align the approaches governments take over time and to ratchet up, to increase the ambition in order to achieve the Paris Agreement's long-term goals of limiting the temperature increase to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and striving for 1.5 degrees. So that's it. The Paris COP, the Conference of Parties held in December there, was it was one of those moments where being in the hall felt like you were part of history. The sense of euphoria when the agreement was finally gavelled through was quite incredible. And the thing began with a gathering of 150 heads of state. I think that's the largest convening of world leaders there has ever been. And remember, this was just 10 days after terrorist attacks in Paris at the stadium and in the middle of town. So security was very, very, very top of mind. But I think those heads of states really wanted to signal that they were ready and that the Paris Agreement should happen. I mentioned stamina before. The negotiations, this is a bit like doing your school assignments or homework. You do tend to leave things until the last minute. So these negotiations go on for, 2 and a bit weeks. And they always run into overtime. The worst, they're supposed to finish at 6 p.m. on Friday. The worst was something like 7 a.m. on Sunday. So it was, and for the last 2.5 days, none of us got any sleep. We never left the conference venue. So it's, that's the stamina bit, and it's pretty grueling, let me say. And it's very unpleasant when people haven't had showers for some considerable time. So that was wonderful to see it gavelled through. My minister had to get on a plane just a little bit before the end, so I was the one that the New Zealand media was turning to for interviews and comments at some ridiculous hour of the night. So I was there in the middle of the complex, holding up my iPad to do a kind of a Skype interview with New Zealand media. And not only my mother, but but she in particular, everybody else said to me afterwards, "Oh gosh, you look so tired." Well, I was. But it was a happy tired. The Paris Agreement entered into force in record time. So it was adopted, and then in order to enter into force, a minimum number of states have to ratify. So within a year, which is almost unheard of for a treaty that size, the threshold had been reached, and the agreement entered into force on the 4th of November. Yes. So that was slightly less than 1 year. 4 days later, there was the American election. We knew that President Trump's views on climate change were somewhat different from his predecessors, and it really became very unclear what might happen. So the Paris Agreement is pretty slim, runs to 11 pages, that's all. It's high level, but in order for it to work, we needed to negotiate a set of rules that, so you have to report. Well, what are you reporting? When do you do it? What sort of level of detail, and what happens with the report? So all of that sort of detail had to be resolved. And I was asked, because I thought that the Paris COP was my last one, I was going to be leaving after 5 years in that role. I was asked to co-chair the process. And the picture up there is of my co-chair, Sarah, who most unusually was one of 2 women on the Saudi Arabian delegation. So the 2 of us were asked to co-chair, and I think just prior to that picture, those are our predecessors in the lead up to Paris. So you can see they look a little bit different, all men. They each took the job for a year or a bit over a year, and it kind of alternated through. When it came to Sarah and I had assumed it would be for 1 year and then it would rotate. But they asked us to stay on, and we ended up doing the role for 3 years, which was good, but also quite tiring and challenging. This photo I really like because I sort of think it looks like some sort of Renaissance court. But this is the 2 of us as co-chairs. There must have been some crisis on the floor at the time, and the Secretariat and the COP president were giving us advice on, and we were deciding what we should do. So this was a pretty tough job. In any multilateral negotiation, in order to get agreement, some cracks end up having to be papered over. You can't resolve everything to everyone's satisfaction. And we use this term constructive ambiguity, which means cracks being papered over. But of course, when we started these negotiations on the detailed rules, the cracks reappeared rather rapidly, and it was no easier than it had been in negotiating the Paris Agreement in the first place. So the role as chair is very different from being head of delegation. And of course, I couldn't be the head of my delegation while I was sitting in the chair. I was no longer representing my national interest. I was neutral as a chair and looking to find compromise. So I think, you know, I was quite scared by this new challenge, but I think it's another one of my sort of the things I live by is setting myself new challenges from time to time. Taking something on that is going to keep me awake at night and make me quite scared. Because you've got, for some of these meetings, 2,000 people in the room. I had seen successful chairing and I had seen chairs crash and burn. So I kind of knew that I would be sorely tested by the participants in the room. Indeed it proved. If you lose control in the chair, the parties will lose confidence in you and you're kind of done for. We were very much in the minority. Well, I was, as first of all, as a head of delegation, and Sarah's a woman on the Saudi delegation. So, and this is, I think, a feature of multilateral negotiations. There are plenty of women in the process, but the higher up the food chain you go, the fewer the women are. And I think part of the reason for our success was that we operated in a different way. We needed to show we were capable, and we did so by projecting confidence in ourselves and by telling people what we were going to do and what they should expect from meeting. We worked as a really close team. We're totally different people. Sarah's young enough to be my daughter, but it was, I think, quite complementary and good. We used humour quite a lot, and we were resilient as well. So we didn't ever have only one plan. We had a plan, but we were always prepared to shift and try something else if it was clear that it wasn't going to work. And sometimes you have to do that incredibly quickly while you are sitting on the stage and while mayhem is unfolding in front of you on the floor. And we made sure we were not bullied in the meetings we had with smaller groups or with individual countries, because I can assure you some of them tried it on. And the final thing I think is really important from my perspective is leading with kindness. And by that I mean expecting the best of people and empowering people on your team to do their very best, to lead with understanding, compassion and empathy, to show respect for other people, including and perhaps especially those with whom you don't necessarily agree. To be completely authentic as a person and to have a vision that inspires. And we did that by setting stretch goals for each of the meetings we were chairing, and then kind of doing a report card next time. I think it's really important to remember that leadership with kindness is not about naivete, and it's not about weakness. It is a form of strength. So after our 3 years of hard work, I'm not sure which slide comes next, let's see. So this is actually the Paris COP. So we're going backwards, and that is the French Foreign Minister and Laurent Fabius at that stage, President Hollande, Ban Ki-moon, and two wonderful women, the head of the UNFCCC, Christiana Figueres, and France's lead negotiator, Laurence Tubiana. And that's the jubilation on the stage in Paris. This next picture I loved. This is John Kerry signing the Paris Agreement in the UN headquarters the following April with his little granddaughter on his knee. And it was very moving. That was very much bringing it completely home to people that this is about the future for your children and your children's children. Then this is the COP last year, the ministerial meeting that signed off on the Paris rulebook that Sarah and I had been responsible for sort of bringing to fruition. And the person jumping, I so admire the cameraman or woman who got that. I think his security detail was having kittens at the time. But that is the Polish minister who had chaired the negotiations. And in his delight, he jumped off the, the table to acknowledge the outcome. So that was a good swan song, I think, from the climate change negotiations for me. I'd kind of done bookends, starting after Copenhagen and then finishing with a really good outcome at Katowice. After that, I moved to Singapore, where it's been very, very different. I've got some photographs I can just quickly run through later on. But it's been very different being in Singapore as an ambassador responsible for the whole bilateral relationship between New Zealand and Singapore, where I never know from one day to the next what I will be doing and what I have to speak about sounding authoritative. But it is an absolutely brilliant experience and a super great privilege to be doing it. So later on, I've got a couple of slides. I take you through the rest of the photographs, but later on I've got just a few sort of my tips for success, most of which I've probably touched on the way.
Well, please give her a round of applause. I learned so much. I remember vividly, this moment when everybody clapping after the Paris Agreement, and it was like such a joyful moment for everyone. So it must be very, for us who watched that, we were happy. I cannot imagine being part of that group that was actually going through the process. So guys, what you went through in Japan and New Zealand, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., nothing. Nothing compared to what Ambassador Joe went through the negotiation. What you went through is just the beginning, but the real work is going to happen after this. We're going to have some questions and answer sessions. And I'd like to start by asking you my questions as a facilitator. How do you deal with frustration? It's a little bit of the script. How do you, have you ever experienced any frustration in very difficult negotiation where, there are many different opinions that you have to facilitate as a chair? And how do you handle this frustration as the chair without showing emotion and also
making sure that everybody still engaged and you yourself being the neutral facilitator as the chair. And doing that while people were hungry, while people, didn't have shower, didn't sleep, hungry people, angry people, people who didn't sleep, they can get you very angry as well. So it's a combination of all of this. So how do you manage that pressure? How do you manage that pressure and then basically manage that with composure, good composure as the chair?
Well, it's quite a tough question. And yes, I mean, the first and obvious thing is that everybody can see you. And certainly in big meeting rooms, there are television screens. So your image is sort of being projected beside you in as a close-up so that everybody at the back of the big room can see. So every sort of facial expression is pretty obvious to the room. And really hugely important not to kind of betray any frustration. I mean, I guess I had different techniques. Sometimes taking careful notes, or at least pretending to. But just, letting it wash over a little bit and knowing quite often what was kind of behind it. The other very good thing about the arrangement I was working with was having a co-chair. So we could take turns for each other.
That's right.
So, and we always thought about, particularly in smaller meetings, which one of us was going to lead, and if necessary, the other one could sort of allow you a bit of a breathing space that would help to make sure that if things were starting to irritate, they would calm back down. But I think the other thing is that you do in those negotiations, you have to separate the personal from the professional.
That's right.
A lot of these people I saw more often than my family because, especially in the lead up to Paris, but even subsequently, we were constantly having meetings of one sort or another. So you become very close to people,
Yes.
and that gives you an opportunity as well to kind of let off, well, not let off steam, but to find ways of remaining calm and coping with the considerable frustrations. One of the worst things is waiting. So at points there will be, particularly as you're drawing towards the end, long periods of time where nothing appears to be happening, but in fact, back in some room somewhere, somebody's having a crisis of some sort, and everything is held up until that happens. And that can be, very anxiety-inducing if you're hoping for an outcome.
Perhaps the second question, and I will invite the colleagues to ask questions. As the chair and the co-chair later with your colleague from Saudi Arabia, what was the most difficult decision that you had to make in the negotiation table?
I think for in these negotiations, there's a mantra that it's a party-driven process. And you hear that a lot from people on the floor, by which they mean they don't want to be dictated to by anyone. Not a chair, not the secretariat, not, anyone else. So the parties have to run the process. But of course, realistically, if you let 197 drivers, behind the seat of a vehicle, you're not going to get anywhere much, definitely not into first gear. So it requires a great deal of careful management. The trickiest thing is to work out when and whether, as a chair, you put a proposal, a text proposal, in front of the parties, and what that text proposal looks like. So again, it was very useful to have a co-chair from Saudi Arabia, or from a developing country. So it was always a developing country pairing, because we could each bring the perspectives of our various, we would know what our colleagues were thinking. We would know where they wanted or did not want to go. But that is the trickiest thing. If you put out the right text at the wrong time, it will be killed. You'll probably you'll lose the confidence of the parties. So yeah, it doesn't sound that tricky. It's not tricky in this disaster sense at all. But it's a tactical and very, very, very difficult decision.
It seems like as the chief, as the chair, at the negotiating table, you have to make the right decision all the time. And basically change plans when things are not according to your expectation. Now, we'd like to invite questions. We know that Ambassador Joe has some more slides to show, but perhaps we can do that after the questions.
Whenever you like.
Whenever,
yeah.
okay. Any questions? We'll invite 3 questions first from colleagues. Please state your name and where you're from. Amelia?
Just ask loudly.
My name is Amelia. I'm from Singapore. First of all, thank you for that sharing. It's very insightful. My question is actually on climate change itself. So, among citizens, I think we can see the various attitudes towards climate change, from the ignorance to the deniers and the indifferent and the extreme activists. So while I personally don't agree with some of the things that the extreme activists do, like hijacking public transport or storming into an MP event, they strongly believe that they need to create such disruptions to make a difference, to push for changes from the big players that will really make a difference. So my question is, how do you view such approach, and do they really make a difference on the negotiating table like they think they are making? And if not, what else as a citizen we can do to make a difference beyond changing our own habits towards climate change? Thank you.
Yes, it is a very good question. Do you want me to answer this one now? Yeah. So, to me, different parts of society play different roles, and all of them are important. I think that some forms of activism can be helpful. I think that the school strikes, for example, they have not involved disruptive activity, but they have signalled very, very strongly that young people increasingly are very, very concerned about the environmental health of the world they are going to inherit. And they do, I think that's an important signal to politicians, but also to others like business, that if you're thinking about how the world is developing and how young people are going to vote, assuming they do vote, and that's really important they do, that you've got to take changing societal views into account. I fear that some of the more radical forms of protest can be a turn-off for politicians, especially for politicians who may not feel particularly positively disposed to taking action on climate change. That to me is, because I understand the strength of the feeling and the passion behind it, but there's a very fine line, and I think it's important not to cross it. I'm a great believer in kind of a virtuous circle rather than a vicious one. So the virtuous circle that I felt has started in the last few years has been, first of all, that the Paris Agreement sent a powerful political signal to particularly the business sector, that here was the direction of the global economy in the long term. So from a business perspective, you'd better start taking action. Increasingly, long way to go, but increasingly the business sector is responding. In New Zealand, for example, there is now a climate leaders coalition of businesses that represent, it's the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions in the country, who are all signalling back that they, as businesses, are taking action and prepared to take action in support of the Paris Agreement goals and so on. There's other pressures that are coming on through the insurance sector as more and more disasters happen, through shareholders in publicly listed companies saying you've got to think about climate risk, you've got to price it in, and you also are seeing shareholders looking at slightly beyond the bottom line to also the kind of ethical considerations before they think about investing in companies. So there's a whole bunch of different signals happening, and they all need to come together to create that virtuous circle. And citizens, their role is to think about climate in their day-to-day lives, what transport they use, food they eat, how they deal with, consumables, particularly plastic, all sorts of things like that. You can do that without feeling that you have to return to some kind of dark age way of life if we've successfully moved beyond that. But we do have to think about living in slightly different ways.
Thank you very much. Actually, I also had that questions, the Greta effect, but you had that questions answered. So, okay, we prioritize the ACE participants. That's from AHA Center. Perhaps the second one? Yes, please. Please state your name, country.
Hello, my name is Tung. I'm from Vietnam and DMO. So I have one question for you. First of all, I really admire of how you get all the nation on board to the Paris Convention. But my question is, you successful in getting everyone on board, but how can you keep everyone on board for a long time? Because after Obama, Donald Trump became the president of the US, and his saying is American go first. What about another country? If there is a re-election and they have like Germany go first or China go first, then how can you keep everyone on board on the Paris Convention? Because cut down the CO2, the carbon dioxide, cut down the industrial, it means that those countries are giving up their interest, their economy, and their influence throughout the world. So how you can keep them up, keep them in the Paris Convention for a long, long time? Thank you.
Another excellent question. I think I can answer that in a couple of ways. So I think the first thing to note is that there hasn't been a domino effect since the President of the United States announced that the US would withdraw from the agreement. No other party has left. Obviously I can't say that would never happen, but the point I was making earlier about the way the Paris Agreement was written, the impingement, the impact on national sovereignty is minimal. It is over to individual countries to determine what they will offer, what they can put on the table by way of undertakings to reduce their emissions. So in terms of an agreement, it's geared very much towards the individual member states. The second point I'd make is that within the United States, I think it's now 23 individual states within the Union have said that they, despite the President's position on the Paris Agreement, they still intend to follow the Paris Agreement objectives and are taking significant action to reduce their emissions. California, for example, is, I can't remember, I'm remembering this correctly, I think it's in itself equivalent to the 6th largest economy in the world. So there is, at a subnational level, still a lot of commitment to the Paris goals. What else can I say? So yes, I mean, we can never say that, with certainty that all will be well. But I think, personally, the tide has been turning, as we were talking before about, what business is doing, the fact that renewable energy is totally cost competitive with fossil fuel energy now, and costs of things like electric vehicles are coming down rapidly with the massive, uptick in production within China. So there's a lot that would demonstrate that we're on the right track. The other thing that is happening is that more and more evidence is coming through that you can take action on climate change without harming your economic development. And that is critical. It's critical to have that information there, because of course no country wants to take action in a way that stifles its economic development. And the last thing I'd say is that the other big shift is, it's early days yet, but it will happen, is in terms of the finance sector, where we are slowly starting to see a shift from, if you like, brown investment to green investment. And the more that happens, and the more developed country governments are helping that to happen by providing climate finance to developing countries, I think that's another important insurance policy, if you like, to keep the Paris Agreement going. The Green Climate Fund just concluded its first replenishment process, and 9.8 billion US was raised in that, so that's topped up that fund quite significantly.
So questions perhaps from the ACE participants? Otherwise I'll invite Hassan to. Okay. Jamil, yes.
Thank you. My name is Jamil from AHA Center. Ambassador Joe, I will ask not about the agreement, because the agreement is up and down still, yeah. I will ask about the impact, because if we are talking about climate change, for instance, the first biggest contributor is like land use change and forestry issue. So if we are talking about ASEAN, for instance, yeah, will be an important issue. Landslide, flood is, yeah, because the forest has been reclaim it, yeah, or for nah. What I'm asking is, what strategy you think we can improve uh, to make people aware on to climate change adaptation and mitigation? Because most of the we are here is a government and activists, for instance, like AHA. How can we deal with that? How to improve the awareness? And the second one is in terms of AHA Center, because if we are talking about disaster, we also have natural disaster category and man-made disasters. In my perspective, climate change is man-made because we extract the forest and then deforestation happen and flood, landslides. So how the exchange between countries in ASEAN, for instance, could be improved? Because in AHA Center we are working to be the hub, yeah, for all of the countries, the member ASEAN, so we can serve the and the issue of climate change is not yet deeply touched, I think, yeah. So how could be improve with that? Thank you.
I'm going to start trying to answer that, but you might end up having to ask me one of your questions again because I might forget. So in answer to your first question, I think there are a number of ways that things need to change. So and a kind of overlooked one is in thinking about our education systems. And the extent to which climate change, what it is and what it means, is taught in schools. It's not, I would think, taught nearly enough. So creating that kind of awareness and understanding at an early age is one very critical and important thing. A second thing, I think, is about alignment. Most of us have governments that have lots of things to do, and different government departments with different roles and responsibilities, and a tendency quite often to operate in silos. The more climate change can be understood as a cross-cutting, mainstreamed issue and factored into decision-making across government, the better things can be. So if you're dealing with transport, a new infrastructure project, thinking about the climate change implications of that project, it's hugely important. Where do you build it? How high do you build it? What do you need to factor into the design to take account of the need to adapt to climate change impacts, for example? Those are, I think, are two quite critical things that can help. I did have a third, but that's I've forgotten now. Now, as I warned you, your second question has now left my brain. Can you remind me what it was? It was about ASEAN working together, but...
What can we do? Because we have a disaster, we are coming from government.
Yes.
And the level of awareness.
I'm not sure I've understood the question exactly, though. If you wouldn't mind asking it again.
Can you make it short?
So I am asking about how to improve the knowledge awareness of the political leaders, yeah, in terms like our multilateral organization ASEAN, and in terms of AHA Center role, knowledge exchange, for instance, how to Yeah.
I think it's sort of the same as the first answer I gave, and that is alignment of policies. I mean, I don't know if anybody has the perfect answer, but in New Zealand, our climate change minister, has brought together a group of climate ministers, so from a range of different government departments. So they do coordinate amongst themselves, and he has asked other ministers with other portfolio responsibilities, like in the energy area or the transport area or health or whatever, to be thinking about what they can do to manage climate change impacts, to reduce emissions in their areas. Another thing from New Zealand's perspective, but this may also work on a kind of region-wide basis, is to get better engagement between local government and central government, and to understand who has responsibility for doing what, because the impacts of climate change are incredibly localised. Even within a country, you can have drought in one area and flood in another, and forest fires somewhere else. The third thing I think is critically important is to ensure that senior ministers and particularly finance ministers are engaged and aware of climate change as an issue. That it's not sort of off to one side as an environment minister's responsibility, because without the one who's controlling the purse strings, it's a little bit more difficult to take action.
Okay, thank you. We know that there are some more slides perhaps that you would like to show us. Perhaps in those slides, we could learn from you on how you deal with the bullies. Because you mentioned leading with kindness. But there will be people who may actually, manipulate the kindness. And how do you deal with that? But over to you, Ambassador. We would like to hear
Sure.
that other aspect of leadership.
So I think, as I've said, it's really important to project confidence. If you come across as unsure, hesitant, uncertain, then people will take advantage of that. And as I also said, I don't think leading with kindness is anything, it's not a weakness at all. And it's not about allowing yourself to be trampled over. So I guess one of my ways of dealing with people who might be trying to intimidate or, bully is to remain calm but firm, sometimes disarm with humour, and to kind of deal with it head on rather than otherwise. So one person, whom of course I will not name, would, if they were coming to have a meeting with me and had a complaint to make, and were going to be literally banging the table and shouting, would begin the meeting by giving me a bar of chocolate. And so instead of, sort of thanking him for the chocolate, well, I would thank him for the chocolate, but then say, you've brought chocolate, so you've got something, you're going to be horrible to me now, so get on with it. And somebody else who, in a meeting, would be quite challenging across the table to many different people. I would just tease him in my response back and acknowledge the fact that he was, of course he was going to disagree with me or whatever it was. Something like that would be a bit of a technique to disarm. So there's probably different ways of doing it, but not losing your cool is important. Okay, other photos. Oh, this just to indicate that you do. Well, I did in my role meet all sorts of people, interesting people. So that's Frank Bainimarama, the Prime Minister of Fiji, who was chairing one of the COP meetings, and the EU Commissioner until very recently, a Spaniard called Miguel Arias Cañete. This is in Poland, in Katowice, right at the end, as we were waiting for one of the closing things. And Sarah and I are flanked by two people from the Secretariat. The man beside Sarah, Sergei Kononov, a seasoned hand. He knew all the tricks of the trade and was super helpful to us in running things. Now we've kind of moved ahead to being in Singapore. So this is when I presented my credentials to the President of Singapore, President Halima Yacob. And traditionally for us New Zealand diplomats, when we present credentials, we have the opportunity to wear a Māori cloak, a korowai. So my korowai is there. Fortuitously, it perfectly matched my outfit. And it was made of wool. You can imagine that before coming into the nicely air-conditioned room there, I had to go out to inspect an honour guard in 35 degrees heat and glaring sun. And I was desperately worried I was going to collapse to the ground and melt before I got through to it. So that's inspecting the honour guard. And fortuitously, again, I discovered that the colours I'd chosen matched completely with, with the guards. The shoes, everything, yes, yeah. Now, to me, this is an important thing. I care about what I wear, and it is something that I think is that it tells people about you. And obviously, the cloak tells something about New Zealand there. But the reason I think it's important is because it projects yourself as you want to project yourself, and it tells a story about you. What I would like to project as being well prepared, professional, suitably formal or informal to the occasion I'm in, culturally respectful, and I guess also using colour as mood so that it can be serious or energy or with a sense of humour or whatever. And I also like to be authoritative but with a little bit of subversion or something in there that takes the edge. There's a bit of colour. So I'm also responsible for the Maldives. And I presented credentials there, again in 35-degree heat and sun. Unfortunately, not in that photograph, but in the Maldives, I had somebody holding a huge umbrella, big traditional umbrella over me, and a guy playing, I'm not sure what the instrument is, but a kind of a wind instrument, not trumpet exactly, but playing that behind me as I was going along the honour guard, and it was quite an amazing experience. Now, this was President Halima just after the terrorist attacks in Christchurch this year. So that happened obviously very, very shortly after I had arrived in Singapore. And there is an interreligious organisation in Singapore which encompasses 10 religions, and the imam who belongs to the IRO came to meet with me and said he wanted to convene a special gathering to commemorate, and acknowledge the appalling events in Christchurch. And he organised this evening. The room was packed. There were about 400 people in this room. And the president came at very short notice and made a beautiful speech and presented me with this bunch of flowers as a token. And the support, the kind of solidarity from the Singapore community was truly wonderful. It was really extraordinary in what was, of course, a very, very difficult time for New Zealand. This is our defence people and my deputy, my wonderful deputy, Laura. Another of the things I did was a dawn ceremony out at Kranji Cemetery, the north of Singapore. And we do this to commemorate what's called Anzac Day. So that's the Australia-New Zealand Army Corps, Anzac. And it commemorates those who have given their lives in battle in either the New Zealand or Australian armed services. It's a lovely, lovely ceremony. And I think about 1,000 people came. So the sun's obviously come up at this stage, but we started in the dark. This is a formal meeting with Minister Balakrishnan, so the Foreign Minister. And fortunately, I knew Minister Balakrishnan because prior to being appointed as Foreign Minister, he had been Singapore's climate change minister. So he and I and my minister and his chief negotiator had lots and lots and lots of meetings and interaction over the years. This is just to demonstrate, every day is different. A group of us, yeah, the piano dress. A group of us, there's about a dozen women ambassadors in Singapore, and we decided to work together to run a competition for secondary school girls for the winners of whom would be an ambassador for a day. So this is my ambassador for a day, Tanishka, who came along with me to all the meetings and everything I did over the course of a day. And then this is New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, and Singapore's Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong. So Prime Minister Ardern came to Singapore in May and signed, along with Prime Minister Lee, an enhanced partnership agreement with New Zealand. And there are a number of other things that were to be signed as part of the day. And there I am, along with the head of the Cyber Security Agency, signing one of the other agreements that was agreed at the time. It was a fantastic day. The Prime Minister was on the ground for only 12 hours, arriving straight from Paris. So she went without stopping from 6 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening, and then jumped on a plane to go to New Zealand. That's just giving a speech about the enhanced partnership back in New Zealand to a business audience. And then this is the New Zealand Chamber of Commerce holds an annual ball. So they began the ball this year with a porphyry, with a group that did a haka and issued a challenge and so on. My role as the guest of honour was to arrive and accept the challenge, which I was very concerned about in my long dress and high heels, because I was going to have to bend down without taking my eye off the warrior who had issued the challenge, and then walk backwards holding the branch, the leaf that he had that signified the challenge. So I was told in preparation for this that I should look suitably scared when the warrior came forward. So we had a group that was partly adults and partly children from the Australian International School, many of whom were the New Zealanders. So the warrior who came forward was brilliant, did a fantastic, really kind of passionate job of it, but he was about 11 years old, so he wasn't hugely muscular, and it was, I did have to act a little bit to be scared. But anyway, there I am giving a hongi to one of the school children who was part of that group. It was a lovely evening. More about, I talked about wearing clothes that were a little bit subversive or appropriate to the occasion. So on the left, those aren't actually boots. It's a pair of stockings that have flames running up them. And that's important for mood. If I'm wearing the stockings with flames, it means I mean business. And the middle one, somebody took that photo. As it happens, I'm wearing the same shoes today, and published it on the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. So it was there for the world to see. And on the right, we had a ministerial meeting in Morocco, and Sarah and I decided that for a ceremonial day, we would go to the souk and get a kaftan each. So she, with her much better Arabic than mine, which is non-existent, did a very sharp deal on the kaftan, and we came back and put them on and wore them for the day, and created a bit of a mini sensation, I have to say. So that's our man from the Secretariat, Sergei, between us, who wanted a photograph. And then I've just kind of said, well, okay, if you're thinking about where you want to go, here are some of the things I've lived by. So when doors, because I never planned a career, it just kind of happened. But when doors opened, I chose to go through them. And if I couldn't find an opportunity, then I tried to create one. As I said earlier, scare yourself sometimes. And if you, and I've done this with other people, I've given people opportunities that they've found really kind of scary. And when they have risen to that opportunity, risen to the challenge, and it's succeeded, it's given them such a boost of self-confidence, and they've gone on to do great things. To me, it's always important to deliver. If you've said you're going to do something, then do it, and do it in a timely way. Be confident and courageous, be authentic, energetic. I think it's really important to project energy into a room, but not kind of in a frenetic way, and the lead with kindness. As climate change ambassador, I think it's important to understand that other people don't always care about what you care about, and nobody else cares about New Zealand's national interest necessarily, unless it happens to be coincident with them. So you have to find ways to be relevant to others. I think that thing about personal relationships really, really matters. You've got to know who you're dealing with and know them beyond, particularly if it's in a kind of adversarial environment. You've got to find ways to get beyond that. And it's personal relationships that help you get to an outcome in the end. For a small country, it was important to be clear, articulate, and constructive. As I said earlier, don't shy away from the tough stuff. And what you say matters just as much as what you do. I'd also said it's important to listen not only to what's said, but also what's not said. It is very difficult, but it's essential to be thinking about, well, you know, why did something happen or not happen? Who was in the room? Who wasn't in the room? Who spoke up? Who didn't speak up? That's all really important stuff. Have a clear vision for what you want or need, and truly important to both empower your team to succeed and then celebrate success. Then I've talked quite a lot about this, so as co-chair, if you're unsure about what to do, buy time. Never lose your cool. Have a plan. Be nimble. So if plan A isn't working, move on. Bring people with you. That's so important. If you don't bring people with you, you are lost. You want to be respected, but you don't necessarily need to be liked by everyone, because not everyone is going to like you. Be authentic. Remind people you're a human being. Use humour, for example. Set those goals that are a stretch. One of the things we did was surprised people occasionally. We innovated, but never by too much. In the UN context, if you surprise people too much, they get scared and they reject it. No way, go away. Yeah. Guide those working on your behalf, but don't undermine them. It was really important. We couldn't cover all of the negotiations ourselves. We had to enlist teams of facilitators to workshop the detail of stuff. And quite often they'd come to us for guidance, or people would be trying things on with them, but it was really important that we didn't kind of undermine them in the work they were doing. And another crucial thing, this is about knowing what kind of sandpit you've got to play in. Where's the sweet spot for a deal that know where it might lie? And it becomes so obvious where it's, you know, the concentric circles, where everything meets in the middle. But it takes a wee while for it to emerge. And then there's no guarantee of being able to land it. That's when having the right text at the right time, for example, is important. That's it.
I love your pictures and I love your dresses. And I think it is important, I agree with you, to dress to impress. And I use that as well. Because that gives confidence, and the confidence is important to be projected, and then after that it will lead you to more confidence. I'm afraid that we have to conclude. We have actually a little bit of time for group photo, but we would like to thank Ambassador Joe for sharing the tips, for sharing the pictures, what she had to deal with and experience. Actually, it's the first time that I listened to a climate change negotiator. It's a lot of things out there, and ASEAN, 10 countries only. When we talk about this, 197. If there is one quote or one tip that I would remember, and I'm sure that you remember many of them, that would be leading with kindness. And I think it's projected in Ambassador Joe, and also in New Zealand. The Prime Minister also tried to show that consistently, and that is tested through the most difficult time, that is the Christchurch. So we hope that we learned and we can implement some of the tips in our daily lives. And we have something for Ambassador Joe. Something that is quite, well, we cannot compete with the dress, the, what do you call that? The, Yes, but a little bit close to that. Yes.
No, no, no.
You can ask me.
Still get points. Thank you. Yeah, yeah.
And ask. So sorry, Adeline.
Yes.
Do not get A, na? Do not, you cannot ask question.
I have point lah.
Do not get A.
Where am I go? Kenapa harus pegang mikrofon ni? Tak jadi, tak jadi. Ibu tak bagi. I wanted to ask this question. Do I get points? I was holding the mic for 15 minutes.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Later, later.